Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel. Honestly, you don't want to be taking generic legal advice from a YouTube channel or podcast in any event. On with the show. Good afternoon and welcome to another Virtual Legality. I am your host, Richard Hoeg, managing partner of the Hoeg Law business law firm of Northville, Michigan. And today we're going to do part 3 of the continuing saga of Star Control Origins, which, if you followed parts 2 or part 1, was taken down from Steam and Good Old Games by virtue of a DMCA takedown notice that was filed by Ford and Reich, who were the original makers of the Star Control and Star Control 2 experiences in the late 80s and early 90s for Accolade. And their delivery of a DMCA takedown notice to Steam and to Good Old Games caused Star Control Origins to be removed. Really the first instance of a major, relatively full-priced video game being taken down after going live by virtue of a DMCA takedown notice. And yesterday, there was a fair bit of big news, which I want to talk about with you. Before I do that, the same disclaimer that I have given to prior videos related to the Star Control Origins situation, I want to give here, which is to say Hoeg Law business law firm of Northville, Michigan is located very geographically proximate to the Stardock headquarters, which is essentially down the street from Hoeg Law. And so I have visited with a number of Stardockians, both personally and professionally, over the course of my career. And I know some of them in that capacity. So if you think that makes me biased, you are welcome to think so. I don't tend to think that it makes me biased in this analysis, but you might. And that's why I like to disclose these things at the start of these discussions. With that all being said, let's dive into what happened yesterday, the articles, and what it really means for exposure of liability, what it means for what different parties are thinking about the various merits of the lawsuits in question on this, and what we can take away throughout. Hopefully this will be a bit of a shorter video than the other Star Control videos. I'm not really going to do a deep dive into legal documents or anything like that, but we do have a few things to discuss. So, what I'm looking at right now is a Dual Shockers article, and this actually happened yesterday, so I'm a little late on this, but I didn't see it in any of my timelines, and I was actually practicing law to a great extent yesterday. So we've got an article here that says Star Control Origins returns to Steam following DMCA takedown. And that's right. Steam has restored Star Control Origins. For those of you following on the YouTube video, I am going to show that Steam has it available for sale at $39.99 right now, and no issues here. This had shown as essentially unavailable prior to this action taken by Steam. And the article goes on to say, one of the nastier legal disputes in regards to gaming recently has been between Stardock Corporation and Star Control 2 creators Paul Reich III and Fred Ford over the recently released Star Control Origins. This ultimately led to the latter pair issuing a DMCA takedown to remove Star Control Origins from Steam and GOG, Good Old Games. Now, a couple weeks after the whole ordeal, Star Control Origins has returned to Steam. And you know that if you've been following these videos and looked at part 1 or part 2. That being said, the game does not seem to be up on GOG at this time, which we can check right now, and we can show that that is, in fact, the case. If we look at a search of Star Control on Good Old Games, we see there's some Star Control Origins characters added to the Galactic Civilizations 3 project that Stardock has that are completely 100% owned by them. They're new to Star Control Origins, period. Their Star Control Origins soundtrack is available for $10, and some multiverse pack stuff, which is essentially stuff in the spaceship creator that is useful for Star Control Origins. Interestingly, Star Control Origins Earth Rising, which is the DLC component of Star Control Origins, does appear to be available. I'm not quite sure how that works since you can't actually use it without the base game, but that's up to Good Old Games and not up to me. So we can see that Steam and Good Old Games, as of right now, January 18th, 2019, disagree on what should be the proper course of action when faced with this particular chain of events. As soon as the game went back up for purchase on Steam, the developers went straight to the game's Steam community page with the following message. Stardock and Valve are happy to report that Star Control Origins is back on Steam. For those of you who have the game already, we encourage you to review it, as we took some review bombing recently. Please spread the word. And yes, their reviews were negatively impacted by the whole brouhaha, especially at the start of this year, but also really throughout all of Star Control Origins' release schedule. There have been folks that have been essentially commenting on the legal proceedings by virtue of reviews of the Star Control Origins product. This article then goes on to say, while I'm sure Stardock is happy to have their game on PC, they do risk getting drowned out within the large pool of Steam games if they are review bombed after being absent from the storefront for over 2 weeks. That being said, the game was available on Stardock's website during this period for a discount, though Star Control Origins has reverted back to full price now that it's available on Steam once more. Stardock's official statement on the matter to press was quite simple, with CEO Brad Wardell saying, Stardock is happy to report that Star Control Origins has been restored for sale on Steam. Hopefully, a DMCA takedown situation like this won't happen again, as a recent tweet from Brad seems to suggest that both Steam and GOG are on Stardock's side, not Paul Reich's and Fred Ford's. Brad Wardell's tweet from yesterday, January 17th, 2019, is, nothing I can discuss publicly, unfortunately, for reasons that the restoration occurred, other than to say that the dispute is Stardock, GOG, and Valve on one side, and Reich and Ford on the other. For those of you who may be unaware of this situation, Reich and Ford believe that Star Control Origins rips off several ideas and concepts from the classic Star Control 2. And the article goes on to kind of describe the legal dispute, which we have talked about at length for multiple hours on this channel and certainly on my Twitter and other social media avenues. So I think it's important now to say, I think this is great news for the industry in general, that at least one provider of services in Valve and Steam has decided to essentially not pay attention to the DMCA takedown and to restore the availability of a game that they received the takedown notice for. But I do think it's important to also understand why, although Brad Wardell might make comments about legal proceedings on Twitter and on social media that don't necessarily reflect the entirety of the circumstances in every event, to state that, in particular, Valve is on his side does seem to be a legitimate standpoint from here, given the legal exposure risks that are going to be entailed by this action from Valve. So I want to talk about those just a little bit. And the place I want to start out talking about those is to take a little look at the denial of preliminary injunction document that was made just before this all happened at the end of last year in 2018. And you may have seen a number of areas of this document discussed by me, I believe in part 2 of this particular video series on Star Control Origins. But in particular, I want to talk about how the DMCA works. And one of the reasons that the injunction was denied is because it didn't serve as its own injunction, that a DMCA takedown notice wasn't an injunction by a private party because it just incentivized the actors. So I'm reading now from the denial of injunction document that was issued essentially against Stardock at the end of last year. As defendants, that's Reich and Ford for this purpose, correctly observe, plaintiffs, Stardock's argument is based on the flawed premise that the issuance of a notice of infringement under the DMCA is the equivalent of an injunction requiring the service provider to remove the allegedly infringing material. It is not. Contrary to plaintiff's assertion, defendants cannot unilaterally block Origins or any other content from distribution by issuing a DMCA notice. They can't force Valve to take the game down. They can't force Good Old Games to take the game down. They can't force anything. What they do is they give a letter and they say, hey, we think this is infringing, and then the DMCA kicks in from there. Back to the document. Such notice simply serves to provide knowledge of alleged infringement to service providers. Critically, receipt of a notice of claimed infringement does not mandate that a service provider remove or disable access to allegedly infringing material. Rather, in providing safe harbor from liability, Title II of the DMCA incentivizes service providers to remove infringing material. Then they go on to quote some case law backing that standpoint up. Plaintiffs claims that the loss of Section 512's safe harbor proves too great an incentive for service providers, causing them to take down targeted content immediately, regardless of the merits or lack thereof of a takedown request. Insofar as plaintiff questions the wisdom of the DMCA process, however, its quarrel is with Congress and not this court, which we discussed in our previous video. as the Ninth Circuit recognized, Title II of the DMCA grapples with difficult and controversial questions of copyright liability, and the notice and takedown process is a carefully considered protocol which strikes a balance between the competing interests of various stakeholders. Which is all to say, that's exactly what has happened here. The court said, hey, we're not going to deny their use of the DMCA because it's not an injunction. They send a piece of information over to the other side and says, you might be liable for this if you continue to sell it, but it's up to you. And then the other side, in most instances that we have seen in the digital distribution of material, say, whoa, we like safe harbors. We like to be free from exposure to liability. So we're going to take that down immediately, which is how Steam and Good Old Games reacted. Looking at the actual act itself, which we're going to pop over to, which is 17 U.S.C. 512. And as per usual, I will put links to all these documents in the description of the video and podcast. We see, as we discussed in our previous videos, that the way the DMC works is to say in C, a service provider, that's the Steams and the GOGs of the world, they shall not be liable for monetary relief. They don't have exposure risk. If they didn't know that something was infringing, or, as we see in C here, upon notification of a claimed infringement, a DMCA takedown notice, they respond expeditiously to remove or disable access to the material that is claimed to be infringing or to be the subject of infringing activity. So, the way the DMCA works is you get one of these letters, and if you take it down expeditiously, you get this safe harbor protection from liability. The second piece of this, and we've talked about this before, is that they're not liable to Stardock for taking down their stuff unless, after receiving a counter notice from Stardock, they don't restore it. Unless, to that, as an exception to that obligation, they first receive notice from the initial claimant, in this case, Ford and Riesch, that such person has filed an action seeking a court order to restrain the subscriber from engaging in infringing activity relating to the material on the service provider's system or network. As we know it in this case, that's the court case that is proceeding. And as a matter of fact, if we look at the letter that was sent to Good Old Games, which is the only letter that we actually have access to, we're going to that right now, we see that this was sent December 28th. This was right after they got permission to do so by the denial of the preliminary injunction that we read earlier in this video and in our previous videos in the series. They say Star Control Origins is infringing. And then to get ahead of the game on this, to make sure that they don't have to send a second letter when they, Steam and GOG, inevitably receive a counter notice from Stardock that says, hey, this is ours, they have a final paragraph in this letter that reads as follows. As GOG knows from prior correspondence and from being named as a counter defendant, copyright owners filed an action in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California seeking a court order to restrain Stardock and GOG from engaging in infringing activity relating to the infringing materials on the service, which is captioned the name of the court case. And so we see, in case anybody was wondering whether or not, hey, maybe what happened is that Steam put it back up because after Stardock sent their counter notice, Steam didn't actually have the information necessary to know that the initial claimant here, Ford and Riesch, had filed a court order, even though that is public knowledge and is presented in all these various video game websites from Polygon to Waypoint to Verge to Engadget and everywhere else, that there was, in fact, a court action proceeding that discussed whether or not Stardock could actually sell their game. It's very difficult for Steam to make that claim. It's absolutely impossible for GOG to make that claim because of that final paragraph. We can assume that Steam basically received an identical letter. It would be unusual for Steam to get a different letter than the law firm that is representing Ford and Riesch gave to GOG. So if we assume that Steam got the same letter, they have that same paragraph, they have that same notice, what this can be read as from the Steam perspective is a legitimate acknowledgement that by putting the game back up, they are losing access to that safe harbor, and they would, in fact, be potentially liable for contributory infringement, for essentially helping Stardock infringe on Ford and Riesch's legitimate intellectual property rights if the court ultimately determines that that is, in fact, the case, that that is what Stardock has done by selling Star Control Origins. So what we can read this as is that the fact that Steam put Stardock's game back up is indicative of a certain feeling as to how this court case is likely to proceed. In general, and this isn't the case for everybody, but in general, a corporation doesn't willfully, on its own, go back into a potential exposure risk, a potential avenue for monetary liability where they could lose money to a court case if they didn't have some analysis, if they didn't have some feeling that that wouldn't, in fact, be the case. And we can actually see from the fact that it went back up on Steam and it hasn't gone back up on Good Old Games that there may be a difference of opinion right here insofar as the in-house or outside counsel of these two companies and how they want to treat this DMCA takedown notice. Because make no mistake, the way the DMCA works, it incentivizes you with that safe harbor, but you can ignore everything and you can put it back up, and then you're potentially liable for whatever happens from there. And I don't know what the profitability of Star Control Origins is at this point. It would surprise me if it's significant enough to move the needle strongly on the Valve and Steam side of things. So I do think that, at least circumstantially, the suggestion is properly read as Steam having actually gone in, looked at the case at issue, and decided that in all likelihood this is a loser case for Reach and Ford, and they're probably not going to have that contributory infringement when all is said and done. And it's going to be worthwhile to pay attention to whether or not Star Control Origins goes back up on Good Old Games, GOG, to see if they also agree. A lot of the times when you have these big corporations working, these high-revenue multinational corporations working, they do take signals from each other as to how they feel about these potential exposure items. So it wouldn't surprise me if after Steam has put it up, which is a bigger revenue source than Good Old Games, that Good Old Games follows suit and says, okay, well, we're all in this together, and at bare minimum, if we're going to do this, we can put this back up now. I do think, as you can tell from the earlier videos, and I do recommend that you watch them, I've talked about what this DMCA takedown notice process really means to the video game industry if it is allowed to essentially take down live games on what are, if not entirely specious claims, at least claims that have certain weaknesses that make them not at all a slam dunk in a court of law and very problematic potentially in actually winning their claims, and how distribution folks, how the Steams, how the Epic Game Stores, how the GOGs, how the Discord stores of the world should feel about these things. And I do think that the industry has a vested interest in potentially doing what Steam has done here and saying, hey, look, we've evaluated the claim. We think maybe it's not that strong of a claim. We don't want to get into the business of taking down games for any Tom, Dick, or Harry that has a potential idea that is remotely similar to a game that's in our store. And so we think it makes sense to make this stand right now. That's all speculation. That's all behind the scenes. Again, I haven't talked to Stardock or Brad or anybody about the details on this. That would I'm not their lawyer. And so I think it's worthwhile to note that regardless of how one feels about the merits of this particular claim, it is an important thing for the industry to be looking at, regardless of how you feel about Ford and Reach and Stardock and Brad Wardell and the rest. And I certainly think that Steam putting the game back up is worthwhile to apply certain inferences about what that means about how certainly one of the biggest actors in video games feels about the claim. So that's really it for today's episode, and that's a virtual legality if you haven't seen one or heard one before. Again, my name is Richard Hoeg, and if you like this, please do like the video, please like the podcast, please review it wherever you're looking at it, and please do subscribe to my channel. I do this a lot. I talk about video games a lot. I talk about software. I talk about information technology and issues related there too, both in business and the law, and I absolutely love doing that. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching.